Okay, let's get on it. The original video is starting now, and you can skip to this timestamp to see the new stuff.
Hello, and welcome to the fourth video in my series about creating a system of clothing for a fantasy race. The race I am building is one I've created called the Nautikans. They are near human, but with a few different biological abilities and limitations. They can breathe underwater and are extremely tolerant to cold, but sensitive to heat and sun exposure. Due to an expanding empire in my world, the Nautikans have almost entirely retreated to the ocean, where they've built an isolated underwater city. Because they have such different needs and limitations, my goal was to create a system of clothing from scratch to fit their culture. In the first video of this series, I came up with a universal baseline, and in the second video, I sorted through what might be considered masculine or feminine to wear. In the third video, I outlined how clothing would differ based on wealth and status, and in this video, I'll be filling in the gaps based on age and situation. The categories I'll be filling in today are seasonal differences of winter and summer, differences between what used to be worn traditionally versus newer, modern elements, and the different preferences between people of different ages. I want to go ahead and get the summer-winter category out of the way. When I first started this project, I didn't think this category would apply, because a contained underwater city would have controlled climate and no real seasons. However, they didn't always live in this city, and probably won't always stay there, or there wouldn't be much of a story. So it bears thinking about what they would do if weather was a factor. As I said in the intro, Nautikans are very tolerant to cold temperatures, almost completely unaffected, but they are quite susceptible to heat, particularly direct sunlight, with a low melanin count and sensitive skin. So when they did live on the surface, they weren't found everywhere. Instead, they favored cool and especially humid climates. Think Ireland, northwestern America, and temperate rainforest-type biomes, and flocked around areas with a high water presence. Coastlines, lakes, rivers, marshes, etc. They would not be able to survive arid climates well at all, and would rarely go to places like deserts, savannas, or even plains. The type of clothing they wore would depend on the temperature and atmospheric conditions. Most days, if they were to be out and about on land, they would cover up with lightweight layers, somewhat similar to how people in arid desert countries traditionally dress. They would add extra pieces to the already established style of dress, maybe wrapping a shawl around their shoulders or adding a set of sleeves to the tops. Some women might use overlong sleeves to give their hands a little bit more sun protection. A whole array of hats, visors, and veils might be worn, and those might vary a lot regionally. There's just something that makes me laugh about the concept of the mainland people getting the idea that the Nautikans are a very conservative culture, based purely on the fact that they always seem to be 90% covered up in public. But then, as soon as they get the first cold, dreary days of fall, and all of the mainlanders bundle up, the Nautikans breathe a sigh of relief and just start shedding layers. Another element of this is one that I'm not sure exactly how to categorize, but this seems like the best place to stick it. That is a conventional mantle or hooded cloak. Those could be used for sun protection or weather protection on the surface, and they probably originated from the surface, but they could also have use in the underwater city as well. A cloak could be used to protect your clothes as you go from place to place, or it could be used for stealth and discretion. A plain, nondescript cloak could be worn over fancy clothes to conceal your class or status, or identity if the need arose. For the winter category, I really don't have anything clothing related, because even if you were trying to dress warmer, the constant presence of water in your environment would make the clothing almost irrelevant. Instead, what they might do during the winter, or if they were traveling in a colder region, is the same as the Yagan people of the southernmost islands of Tierra del Fuego in South America. The Yagan people were really interesting and unique, and I took a lot of my inspiration for the Nautikan biology from them. But one way the Yagan people protected themselves from the cold was by coating their bodies in animal fat for insulation. And that is something the Nautikans could do as well if the circumstances required it. They might even get fancy and infuse the fat with oils and perfumes, almost like a lotion, but serving a different purpose, insulating instead of moisturizing. There might even be a whole industry of competitors with their own secret recipes for scented creams. Maybe there's even a system to rate the insulation properties, like we have for SPF in sunscreen. For the Nautikans, rather than specific styles being traditional or modern, it is the materials that have drastically changed. The underwater city has only existed for about a century, and its creation both required and caused a boom of invention. But before that, they had plenty of contact and trade with the mainland, and had access to all sorts of materials that weren't quite as suitable, but cheap and worked well enough. They might have used wood for construction and tools. They used leather for straps and belts. Shells and pearls were used for decoration and in jewelry. Ivory from whales and other fish was carved to make brooches, bangles, and crosspieces. If you saw any of these materials used in a piece today, it is most likely an antique or a family heirloom, something your grandparents would wear on festival days, then pass down to you as a wedding gift. In modern society within the underwater city, The materials used are both more advanced and more limited. Nautikans have replaced everything they can with metal they produce themselves, a rustless bronze alloy they have perfected. They use small chains and strips of chainmail for straps, and tiny metal seed beads for decoration. Though still available, ivory has fallen out of fashion, as have shells and pearls. Those elements are considered old-fashioned or country to wear. Nowadays, colorful glass enamels are preferred to decorate jewelry, or real gemstones if you can afford them. For special pieces, other metals such as gold, silver, or copper might be used. However, care must be taken to keep these items clean in the moist environment. Most cultures have particular ceremonies or functions where some kind of traditional clothing is used. These might include religious rituals, coronations, wedding attire, festivals, and performance artists. Perhaps a traditional part of a festival involves wearing metal masks decorated to look like a certain mythological figure or spirit, or maybe using masks in reenactments. Maybe for weddings they wear formal clothing, but in undyed gray silk to symbolize the clean slate a marriage begins with. Maybe they decorate with pearls for weddings to represent their heritage and origin in the sea. Maybe during court proceedings, the queen of the city wears an elaborate headdress resembling a fish, based off artistic depictions of one worn long ago by the kings of old, who in turn based their headdresses off the sea god they worshipped. The long-running wars happening on the surface, and the Nautikans' ongoing state of preparation have changed society, and some effects have leached into the clothing styles. It is more common now for both male and female civilians to carry weapons and wear casual armor. Even those who do not wear armor have started to adopt some clothing elements based off the armor, such as making jewelry with the scale mail technique, or wide enamel cuff bracelets evolved from protective bracers. Along with the boom in technology, there would be one device that I think would be essential for an underwater city to invent, and that is a timepiece like a pocket watch. Maybe it is worn hanging from the belt? And one final thought on modern style, the cut of clothing. So throughout history, clothing has evolved and changed, and sometimes quite logically, sometimes making great leaps. I built in room for such evolution through their history in the way fabrics are wrapped, and how the style of wrapping might have evolved, with the trends rising and falling. However, in the modern era, cut off from trade as they are, I think a new trend would have arisen to conserve fabric, and that is to cut into it and sew some different tunics and pant styles. The advantage of doing that is that you would use much less fabric, but as each length of silk is considered a unique piece of art unto itself, the idea of cutting into it would seem very heartbreaking, so only select individuals would opt to do this. The poor, those who need to make their materials and money stretch, the ultra-modern, ready to cast traditions aside and embrace the future, and those seeking to make a political statement through their mode of dress, aligning either with the poor or the ultra-modern. The youth are constantly driving fashion forward, trying to be more innovative and daring than their parents, though they usually end up just repeating the same cycles. I think it is completely reasonable that females of the previous generation started wearing something similar to our concept of bikini bottoms underneath their pants. This would have the practical application of keeping the pants clean and helping them last longer through fewer washings. Maybe some males have started to embrace the idea, but it is not as widespread. However, in the current generations, some young females have started to leave their baggy pants behind when swimming. The silk is extremely lightweight and doesn't soak up much water, so it has never really been a problem to swim when wearing pants. But the younger generation, trapped below the surface, appreciates the freedom. I think there would be quite a lot of pushback from the older generations, like there was when bikinis were first invented in our world, or when Victorian women first started wearing bloomers. Maybe it's still considered a scandalous thing that could ruin a daughter's future, or maybe there is legislation introduced to try and outlaw it. But in the end, I think the young girls will win. That does seem to be what usually happens. And we come to our final category, the age gap. For children, I think they would wear similar styles to that of their parents, but very simplified. Less jewelry, simple styles of wrapped tops, easy for the children to learn themselves. I don't think there would be as much of a divide between the little boys' clothes and the little girls' clothes, certainly nothing as definitive as the men's and women's styles. The little girls wouldn't wear the bra tops underneath their wraps. For adults, everything we've covered up to this point counts. However, I think a line should be drawn for the contrast between the young adults and the elderly, for they will certainly each be heading towards a different extreme. In the last section, we covered the young ladies wearing of bikini bottoms underneath their clothes, and publicly exposing themselves when in the water. The young people tend towards what is daring and revealing, enthusiastically utilizing the modern elements discussed previously, whereas the elderly would dress much more conservatively, covering more skin and maintaining the traditional elements that the youth are so quick to dismiss. The elderly still appreciate pearls, while the young are all about the colorful glass enamels. The elderly cherish their antiquated carved ivory jewelry, while the young are into scale mail. It's kind of one of the beautiful things about life. The young are always trying to innovate, create, and improve, while the old are there saying, don't forget the past, don't forget what was good. And we have come to the end of this series. I thank you all for listening in, and I do apologize for how long it took to finish. I had a busy spring, and I seriously overcommitted with the art for this video. But I'm hoping to get back to making videos more regularly now, but I'll have to figure out a more expedient way to make illustrations. Some of them will be sewing videos, some will be world building, with more about the Nautikans and other cultures of my world. If that's something that interests you, subscribe and stay tuned. Also, I'd be very interested to know if anyone else has tried to use my chart or this method to come up with clothing for their race. I tried to make it as universally applicable as I could, but I'd be interested to hear about other people's venture into this particular black hole of world building. Okay, see you next time. Thanks for watching, and thanks for commenting.
So for this one, I feel like I've already preemptively retconned everything I want to retcon. Bikini bottoms are mostly out in favor of unisex undershorts. The modern cut clothing is out. I still like a lot of the general concepts: metal masks, hooded cloaks, drapey layers of clothing, especially on the surface. Things like ivory and shells and pearls being traditional, and colorful enameled metals as modern. I wish I had all the time in the world to redraw my people, give some of them better faces, and align the clothes with some of the more realistic patterning methods I came up with in this video. However, I do not have the time to devote to such a project, so we'll just recolor them to match the new palette. Ah, much better. I did tweak the palette a tiny bit since last time. Not much, just editing it down a bit, cutting some of the shades I knew that I'd never use. Making this chart and the original 4 videos was an excellent exercise to come up with the general ideas and the direction I wanted the clothing to go. However, it was limited to a single point in time and a single location. To really finish it off, I should have made a 5th video, going into more detail and depth about the timeline and the different branching subcultures of Nautikans through history, and how their clothing might have developed differently. So that's what I want to focus on in this update, though it is tricky. There's a lot of history that I don't want to get into yet because it belongs in larger stories, and then there's a lot of things I still don't know about the world. But let's see what we can do. Nautikans originated on a remote island an unknown number of millennia ago, estimated between 5,000 and 7,000 years. At first they had contact with another island civilization, a group of humans, but that connection was severed very early on for plot reasons. But it was the first generation of Nautikans' only exposure to organized society, where they learned about things such as government and clothing and writing. Given the amount of Thai inspiration that has gone into the Nautikans, I think it's likely that the humans they were in contact with were either descended from or closely related to the people of Thailand. From their earliest history, Nautikans held a desire to be identified by their humanity, rather than their aquatic origins, so they clung to the only real sample of humanity they had. Remember back when I said that a group of confused aliens trying to appear human was actually a perfect description for Nautikans? The clothing of many cultures on Earth began with loose tunics and then evolved pants later on, but I think pants would have been strongly preferred by early Nautikans, as a way of demonstrating the possession of separate legs rather than a fishtail. The production of fabric in the early days was time-consuming and difficult. The only good, durable fabric they had was sea silk, produced by collecting clam byssus. The byssus was spun and woven on small hand looms, in pieces of only between 2 and 4 feet wide, but between 6 and 12 feet long. It was treated as precious, painted with ornate designs inspired by the aquatic life around their island, and dyed using sources from the island and the sea. The first pants were extremely simple. One wide strip was sewn into a tube, with an opening right at the middle. The pants were held up by tying sashes or fish leather belts around the waist, or slinging them over the shoulders. As I discussed with sari, it also became common to wear another strip of fabric, which was very versatile but predominantly was kept handy to cover the upper portion of the body whenever in the direct sun. For hundreds and thousands of years, the clothing changed little. Their island was small and slowly filled and overflowed back into the ocean. Therefore, status and wealth were extremely important if you wanted to live on the surface. Clothing and jewelry were an important visual signifier of status. Nautikans used crop selection to grow the clams larger and larger and produce more and more byssus. They passed on their silks to the next generations, and voluminous silk clothing began to command respect, synonymous with an affluent, established family line. They collected pearls and beautiful shells from the ocean to adorn themselves with, and carved ivory into plaques that could be framed with pearls. The weight of the jewelry was also valued for the stabilizing effect underwater, so elaborate decorations worn at the core of the body, the waist, the chest, the shoulders, and in their hair became commonplace. Over time, they realized the effects of sun damage were not just cosmetic, it also affected health. Health and beauty have always been connected, and wearing layers of silk became beautiful for its protective qualities as well as costliness. It is a bit of a contradiction. They want to live above the surface, even though they are inherently poorly suited for it. But humanity is full of similar contradictions, and maybe it isn't so contradictory. Because raising children in beautiful, clean pools versus the open and dangerous ocean waters would obviously be preferable to many. So maybe it was more of an issue of prioritizing the vulnerable lives of their children in the present over a vague and nebulous future of potential ill health. Let us jump forward in time. The Nautikans knew larger land masses existed. Why did they not leave their overcrowded islands? They were perfectly suited to developing seafaring technology, so why did they behave as though there was an invisible barrier keeping them trapped on their island? Well, there was an invisible barrier. Let's call it the Great Spoiler Reef. However, roughly 800 years in the past, there was a worldwide cataclysm. The following apocalypse nullified the barrier and decimated the Nautikans' island home. Most were able to escape to the comparative safety of the deep ocean, but those who remained ashore were killed. A migration to the mainland was now not only possible, but necessary for survival. The Nautikans arrived in groups on a shattered continent, the inhabitants engulfed in a post-apocalyptic chaos. They fit right in, as everyone scrambled to claim new land and new structures of power in the vacuum. The core of the Nautikans took a group of clean, glittering lakes in the valley between the coast and the Jade Mountains. They gathered around those lakes, and the Lake Nautikans became the heart of the new Nautikan society. But there were others. Small factions of Nautikans set up on the coastal harbors and islands closer to the mainland, and developed their seafaring technology, eventually creating wealthy trade empires and becoming powerful city-states. The Nautikans also spread inland, mingling with the mainlander populations and assimilating with new cultures to greater and lesser degrees. A large group made it clear across the continent, claiming a mostly unwanted swamp for themselves. They became the wetland Nautikans, and there were the river Nautikans, those who split off from the rigid lake society and went into the Jade Mountains, where they had more space and freedom to live how they wanted. So we have several subcultures of Nautikan society forming during the same part of history, but in very different locations. Each has different climates and terrain to work with, and different lifestyles and resources. Their mode of fashion would evolve according to their requirements and the available materials, and it would also be impacted by the mainlander populations now that they were in contact. I don't want to get into too much detail because I don't have time for all of that art, but here's a general outline of how each group might develop. The Lake Nautikans were always considered the heart of Nautikan society, entrenched in rigid traditionalism. They would have taken the original styles and elaborated on them. The colors and patterns used to paint their silks would expand and take on more symbolic significance. They learned the art of metallurgy and were quick students. Perhaps their earliest contact with the mainlanders alerted them that mainlander women of most cultures typically wore skirts or dresses, and the desire to show that they are much closer to human than mermaid led them to adopt that element of culture, as well as others. I think this is when the manner of dress became more standardized and more obviously gendered. Women drape their tops one way, men do another. Women wear brooches, men wear belts. Women do this with their hair, men do that with their hair. The men wear the cross pieces, the women wear the jeweled necklace bras. The river Nautikans were an offshoot of the lake culture. I sort of associate them with the people of Appalachia and other mountainous regions where there is a separation from cities and where people have often gone to get away from the rules and strictures of society, to live the way they want to live. At least that's my romanticized take. So clothing in the mountains would develop more simply and practically. Perhaps they cover up less, and perhaps the women eschew skirt wearing and return to their tube pants. Perhaps they start wearing webbed gloves to make swimming against the river currents easier. Then there are the integrated Nautikans. They would vary greatly depending on what cultures they became part of. But I do think one of the things they adopted early on was a sort of hooded jacket and lower arm wraps as a simpler form of sun coverage. And then there are the island Nautikans. I think their fashion would get wild. They are wealthy and connected with full access to continental trade, but being separate from the Lake Nautikans and only ruled by a single island government, they also have more freedom to break tradition. I think they would have rapidly shifting fashions and incorporate styles from all across the mainland. Not on a practical basis like the integrated Nautikans, but on a random whimsical basis. Oh, I like that! I want to wear something like that! And finally, the wetland Nautikans. I think there is a lot of room to develop this group. They are the most remote and isolated group, but they are also large enough to form their own strong subculture. They're also the furthest north, which, since this is a southern hemisphere continent, means they live in the hottest climate. However, they deserve a lot more thought and development of their own, so let's leave them be for now. All of these cultures and subcultures developed over the next several hundred years. The land settled back into a new stability and eventually entered a feudal age. This lasted a long time, but the kingdom slowly climbed out of it until about 100 years in the past, when one kingdom began to expand into a new empire. The people of this new empire, called the Enosi, were fanatics and extremists who believed that a second apocalypse was coming. It was and still is debated whether this was an honest fear or if their rulers simply used the idea to manipulate and spurn the people into action. They spread quickly. Many people joined freely, believing in the prophesized apocalypse and the idea that the entire continent must band together under one government to ensure mutual survival. Those that resisted were beaten back or absorbed against their will. When tensions are high and society is destabilized, people tend to retreat to the safety of the familiar. From what I've observed of the world, it seems to be an element of human nature, though not necessarily a good one, because it often leads to minority groups within a society taking the brunt of suspicion and hostility. So in the early days of the Enosi expansion, the Lake Nautikans began to see an influx of integrated Nautikans escaping back to their own people. The more isolated Nautikan families began to feel their isolation as a vulnerability, surrounded and outnumbered by different races and species of mainlanders. So many left, and those that stayed were absorbed when their homes were overtaken by the Enosi. The king of the Lake Nautikans watched the land being taken around him, and saw the danger drawing near. He also believed an apocalypse was coming, but he did not believe it was in the best interest of his people to join under the imperial banner. Instead, he began to send more workers to deep offshore mining facilities. They began construction of airtight buildings and domes deep underwater, built upon the sunken ruins of their former home island. Hiding underwater had saved them from the first apocalypse, so the Nautikans would withdraw and wait out the destruction of the second, watching the Enosi try and fail to save themselves. Then the Nautikans would rise up and claim the land once more. With the Imperial forces drawing closer, the Lake Nautikans evacuated. They took their children and what material goods they could carry and melted into the lakes, vanishing from the face of the world. The Nautikan city-states were under attack as well. Many tried to scatter by boat to other islands, but force of numbers overtook them. The smart ones also retreated to the deep, begging the Lake King for asylum. The river Nautikans and the wetland Nautikans were more protected through natural barriers, and by the fact that they did not possess much wealth or highly desirable land to begin with. However, eventually the Enosi led an incursion into the hills, taking down the Jade King. The people scattered into the high mountains, hiding in their cave homes carved into the rocky cliffs of the rivers. They were very difficult to track, and scattered, and stubborn people. Enosi presence in the valley slowly increased, and the river Nautikan numbers dwindled, as they were captured or gave up and escaped downstream to the ocean. Today there are only a few left. The wetland Nautikans are the last holdout. Their swampy home is extremely easy for them to protect, and difficult for the Enosi to penetrate. So they are holding strong, for now. Meanwhile, the underwater city has grown and expanded to house the multitudes of Nautikans it now provides refuge for. The transition to living wholly underwater was difficult at first, but many of the young today have never even visited the surface. Fashion has evolved again. Wealth was once displayed through volume, but that is no longer practical in the cramped corridors and overcrowded dome parks. So fashion has slimmed, and wealth is now shown through intricate tailoring. Structured bodices, decorative but functional armor, perfectly fitted skirts, and increasingly elaborate metal jewelry decorated with colorful enamel inlays. The rigidity of the Lake Nautikans is still the central power, and for those who don't like it, well, they can go live submerged or they can return and face the Enosi. Now, the comments. Alphabetically. This comment suggested the use of alligator or crocodile leather for Nautikans. I replied that I was ignoring alligator leather so that I could reserve it for the wetland Nautikans. I don't have much on the wetlanders yet, but alligator leather is a definite. And while most Nautikans favor metalwork over woodwork, I think the wetlanders would reverse that, because they are the furthest away from the mines and metal trade, and also because soft willow-like wood is plentiful in the swamp. So they do a lot of weaving, like this girl from the Sommerfolk, if any of you read that as a child. So alligator leather, lotus linen, and woven reeds. That's all I got right now. This comment asked if I was ever going to flesh out the different uniforms. I'm not planning on it yet because there's too much I still don't know about the culture right now, and also because there are some things I find really enjoyable to world build while writing a story, problem solving as I go, and letting the world materialize around the characters in my head. So yes, eventually, if it's relevant. This comment was about glasses and prosthetics and wheelchairs. Well, for one, unless you have a magical, world building out, I think that technology is probably the most important factor. I try not to look too harshly on the people of the past for not trying harder to help people when the technology just often didn't exist or was completely inaccessible. I think comparing ourselves to history is like comparing ourselves to Star Wars, where the technology is advanced enough that losing an arm is no big deal and you'll be perfectly fine by the next scene. People who lived in a world like that would probably look at us very poorly. However, the current-day ocean Nautikans are generally the most advanced on my world. Glasses I don't think would be super necessary for nearsighted people. The main reason we need to see distances now is because we drive cars and life comes at you fast. That's my opinion and a theory, so feel free to disagree. For farsighted people, glasses would be more useful, particularly if you read. But it might also be expensive and an upper-class luxury. I don't know. For prosthetics, I don't think their technology is that advanced, but I do have a non-Nautikan character with an arm break that didn't heal correctly, who wears a Nautikan-made brace if that answers the question. And for wheelchairs and other disabilities, I don't really know, but it may be that those who can't walk are some of the ones who prefer to live underwater for ease of movement. But I don't know. Again, technology is important, but wealth is also an undeniable factor when it comes to treatment, medical and social. I've been getting a lot of comments in the updated videos about domesticating fish. I don't have a lot of answers yet, but yes, please. I think it would be really cool to explore aquatic domestication, and I don't think a lot of that has been done in real life. Fish are plenty smart, so there's no reason it couldn't be done, but we just don't spend enough time in the water. So it would be really cool to do that with Nautikans. Another reason I like the idea is because I want to keep the contrast between Nautikans and avians high, and I've already established in other things that most of my avian cultures have a strong aversion to animal domestication. We'll get into why later. But it would be interesting to see such opposite takes. This comment discussed the politics of fabric dyes and different colors. I like it a lot, but I don't have anything else to add. This comment brought up furniture. I don't have much there, but the comment stuck out to me because I was literally just thinking about how the Nautikan houses I've envisioned are currently empty rooms or just rooms with beds. So yeah, that's something I should work on. Okay, this comment was under the original video. It's almost a year old and I don't remember reading it, though I'm sure I did. Which makes me wonder how many of the ideas I'd already had and the commenter just predicted me, or how many of their ideas stuck with me subconsciously and then eked out later. I really don't know. This comment recommended another world building channel called Nakari Speardane. I looked it up and I really like it. I'm about halfway through the videos right now. Her video style is very similar to Eva from World Building Notes, but her art style is different. And of course her ideas are completely different. High recommend. I mentioned this comment in the last video about beads weighing the hair down while swimming, but there was another comment I missed below about short hair. Yes, I think hair length and elaborate braids would absolutely correlate with wealth. I think shortcuts would be less common for women because it would mean that they can't wear the hair jewelry they love so much. But the more uncommon something is, the more significant of a contrast it provides if a character does choose it. Now, there were two comments about tattoos. I love the idea of octopus ink tattooing. It's another example of how people's interests inspire their worlds. I am not into tattoos, I have no tattoos, and the thought of tattoos literally never crossed my mind. But I love the idea now. I think Pacific Islander type tattoos would be very cool and would fit with the oceanic themes, but that might just be because I don't know much about tattoos, so my brain is defaulting to the first thing I can think of. But it's worth more thought and development than I have the time to give it right now. I had a few comments requesting that Zari wear some kind of liner beneath her leather top. Fine, there you go. You happy? This comment really reflected something I've been thinking about lately. No one person can fully create a world, not even an imaginary one. We aren't actually omnipotent, omniscient gods, even though world building is maybe the closest feeling. But everyone is limited by their knowledge and interests. I love clothes, and I've put an inordinate amount of time into that aspect. And music I know and care nothing for, and have put zero effort into. But somebody else recently messaged me on Instagram asking about music and offering suggestions. So I love the idea of this world slowly expanding beyond what I can do alone and incorporating other world builders' specialties. People on YouTube have done that in collaboration with other YouTubers, though I also love the idea of doing collaborations with people who have good ideas, even if they aren't on YouTube. But don't hit me up, I am not ready for that yet. Alright, let's wrap this up. The next updated video will be the Nautikan biology video, which is a doozy. It is my second least favorite video after that first conlanging video. If you aren't aware, I have another YouTube channel that focuses on sewing, though I'm probably going to be building a chicken coop soon, unless Facebook Marketplace provides a miracle. And I also have 2 Instagram accounts, one for my main channel and one for the Worldbuilding channel. So yes, like, comment, subscribe, algorithm boost, all the good stuff. See you later.